We created Babylon 5 really out of the thin air, and that's what I think was so exciting about working on it.
Babylon 5's universe is a achievable future. I said, make the design look like something we can build right now, because in theory we could.
He really wanted kind of this teeming place that was an outpost, and a place that was unlike any kind of place we'd seen in science fiction television before.
It was realistic. People really lived in this place, and that's what we wanted to communicate.
When Babylon 5 initially started, it was decided, and with good reason, that we produce it away from the studio.
We were looking for a warehouse space because we knew that if we went on a lot somewhere that at the budget level our show was in first few seasons, we'd never be able to get through the whole season. And as it was, we barely got through the first season.
We acquired a large property in Sun Valley and built 3 stages.
I had 6 weeks from the time we found the stage to the time we were going to roll on the first episode. And so I had to build 12 standing sets and build 3 sound stages within this 60,000 square foot warehouse. And the reason for having 3 stages, we could be building on one, we could be painting and dressing another, and they could be shooting on the third one. So it was a big shell game.
One thing I wanted from the very beginning was a production designer who came from a theatrical background.
I knew that with a lot of techniques we'd used in the theater, we could come up with a lot of illusion. And Joe was very much behind this. Joe also had a theater background. John Copeland had a theater background.
One of the things that John and the entire art department brought to this production was this interchangeability and adaptability of being able to turn things inside out that they brought from their theater backgrounds.
I think that every set, with the exception maybe of the med bay, doubled as another set. The Zocalo would also become the central corridor. It would also become its own kind of down below, and in some scenes it would become like the core, you know, where we were actually having the reactors and stuff like that. The quarters would always double, so Ivanova and Sheridan would have the same quarters. Delenn and Londo shared the same quarters, completely different dressing. And this is one of the greatest things about art direction is, even though it's painted the same color, even though it in many cases has the same furniture, if you change the dressing, all of a sudden you have a whole new set. And I love that about that show. We would do that a lot. Joe was very interested, though, in keeping a specific definition between the different worlds.
I always tried to follow the rules of A, form follows function, and B, a culture informs its artifacts.
We asked him, for example, what are the Minbaris like? And he said, well, this is basically a dying race. And so he really wanted it to be based on sort of a crystal look, but almost like the crystal, all of the color had gone out of the crystals. The Centauri, however, had the appearance of sort of this Napoleonic, you know, kind of world where it was very this imperialism. And we even kind of went that way with this kind of encrusted gold thrones and, you know, sort of the relics of an imperial nation. And the Narn culture, he had said, well, they're sort of marsupials and they're sort of lizard-like, and they have had war on their planet for so long that they basically live underground in rocks, and it's a windswept planet and very sunburnt.
We didn't base it so much on the future and what we thought the future would be. We based it on what the race's aesthetic would be.
The basic process in creating a new set for Babylon 5 would start with the script.
I sat down with John and said, this is what I need to have in here. This is the basic minimum requirements for the action I have planned to take place. He would then go off and come up with 4 or 5 different designs. And we also had to then take those designs and say which one of these will work in the space that we have available to us.
From that point, I would talk to the decorator, and he would go on his journey.
I racked my brain to find unusual things, and when we ran out of unusual things that we could just pick up somewhere, we had to have them built.
And right away, I would put together, with some cardboard and some paper, I'd do a little sketch, and then I'd do a little white model. And this white model became an invaluable tool, and we literally had a white model for every set.
He would come back with the small models of those sets for one last check to make sure we were all on the same page. Then they get the building.
From that point, usually we're in such a quick schedule that I really never did much color information, and we would go over and I would pick some colors out, and there's this kind of very spongy kind of technique we use in the theater. It's called scumbling, and so most of the sets had scumbled walls, and what that gave the show was this kind of magnificent depth, because a lot of the walls became this sort of almost like painter's palette in the background that you could light these wonderful faces against. By the time we get to the 3rd season, we know there's going to be a big war, and it's going to be a shadow war. We didn't really have a place that would be considered like a war room. And this became a project that we started early in the season. So we started a very ambitious building plan, and we wanted to be a beautiful set. We also wanted to evoke the idea of these kind of war rooms from many other movies, and raised the whole production design of the show up a notch. Finally, after 2.5 years, we kind of got to the point where we needed to be, where we could really manufacture a set that really had a signature Babylon 5 look. One of the things we did in season 3 was to redesign the Med Lab. The Med Lab had really been a set we inherited from the pilot, and we sort of cobbled it together in season 1. Frequently, we found in season 1 and 2, we would bring somebody in a gurney, and then they'd have to like prop them up and get them, we'd have to do really a cut, you know, a really old-fashioned cheated cut, and get inside the operating room. So we really decided to have these wonderful doors built that were these guillotine doors that went up, and that way you could wheel the gurney in and all the way into the Med Lab. And I took that opportunity to kind of blow the Med Lab apart. There had been so many problems with the Med Lab from the beginning, and it was kind of defining what is future of medicine. And we knew that less would be more, you know, and the less we showed, the better off we would be. This kind of central chamber really came into its own with these beautiful glass panel windows and this kind of wonderful way that we could extend the Med Lab if we needed it. And by the time we got the Med Lab done at the beginning of the 3rd season, it really looked great. Unlike many shows where they have to be frozen in time, the show kind of grew with the characters, and the station grew with it, and things changed and over time, and I think that was great. The White Star was a spaceship that was to be unlike any other, and it was designed sort of by the Minbari and the Vorlons, and it was to be sort of the new ship of our alliance. Most of the Earth Force things were clunky, and many of the Minbari things, we really didn't see the interior of them. But this was a ship that was really much more like a traditional science fiction kind of interior. And it went through very many permutations, and the first time you see the White Star, you'll see that it looks very different from the next time you see it. We did a big redesign on it, and we got it to a point where it looks better, but it was really kind of trying to break our own rules even, and trying to come up with something that doesn't look like anything else. There was no straight lines in it at all. It was all this kind of very streaming, kind of organic look to it. And it was a really interesting design problem, and was probably the hardest thing that we did on the show. When we needed a costume designer for Babylon 5, Joe and John came to me and they said, "Do you have anybody?" And I said, "You know, I have this great person," and her name was Anne Bruce.
The people of Babylon 5 and the alien races seemed familiar somehow, and so they would be more accessible. And I think that that's something we really achieved fairly well, is that the Minbaris come across as real, and the Centauris come across as, I mean, flamboyant, but real. And there was less costumey about it as just the clothing of those particular worlds.
As we got toward year 3, I said to Anne, I need to move these characters into a different space with the costume as well as with the story. And she came back with various designs. What we came up with was very simple, very sleek, very elegant, but sold the idea of a renegade operation.
And Bruce and I developed this really wonderful palette for the show, which we kind of called Spicy Brights. And they were basically warm grays, warm tones, and certain kind of reds, certain lavenders, certain greens that were not really true colors. The only real true primaries we used were when we had to do a red stripe or a green stripe, but there were these sort of secondary colors that became this kind of warm glow of the show.
We started with 12 sets. By the end of the 1st season, we could do over 100. By the end of the 3rd season, we could do 365 sets.
We got to take our world and project it into the future and try to peek into other worlds. And I think for us, this was a great ride to be on. The significant thing for me was that with Anne Bruce and John Flynn and John Copeland and Joe, we created this world that doesn't look like any other show. You know, I'm very proud of that, and also the fact that we did it in a collaborative method where it was really the sum of all the parts that made it really as good as it is.